All right, so a couple of things before we get started and kind of get into the panel proper. First, thank you for coming. This is the first time that we have done an in-person event as the New York Media Meetup in almost 4 years. So it means a lot to us for you all to show up and remember who the heck we are after all that time. And if this is your first time at one of these events, want to give you a little bit of context about the meetup itself and also who I am. So we'll start off with who I am. I'm JJ Colao. I founded the meetup about 9 years ago, right when I founded a PR company called Haymaker Group. And prior to that, I was a reporter at Forbes for about 3 years covering tech and startups and venture capital and that whole world. And what we try to do with the meetup group is basically get panels like this together at least once a quarter, usually more often than that, and talk about some issue related to either the craft or the business of journalism. And so today we're going to talk about both of those topics, probably mostly the business. And if you like what you hear, we hope that you'll come back. We certainly hope that you'll give us feedback because we really want to do a better job of making this more of a collaboration and more of a back and forth between us and the wonderful group that you all are. So with that, why don't we get into the panel? So want to do a quick round of introductions to our two fantastic panelists who probably need no introduction, but we're going to start with Sara. So Sara Fischer is a senior media reporter at Axios, where she's been for about 6 years. And you're looking at my notes right now. I hope this bio,
is it an outdated bio?
It should be updated. Sara is also a media analyst at CNN, so writes the Axios Media Trends newsletter. And if you are in this room, odds are you have read that. And if you don't, you definitely should. I would say it's required reading for anybody interested in media. And previously spent time at the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and Sara is normally based out of DC, but is in New York often enough that this worked out, and really appreciate you coming out, not just for this, but for being here. And then we have Peter Kafka, who, Peter, you have so many conflicting titles these days. I don't know if you're part of Recode or Vox or...
Recode doesn't exist, so
yeah.
we'll say Vox.
Okay, senior media correspondent at Vox.
Yeah, how about that?
We'll go with that. So Peter is the host of the Recode Media podcast, and that is a must listen as well. I really hope that everybody in this room signs up, subscribes. Also launching the Land of the Giants Twitter season today, which is fantastic, at least the first half of the episode that I listened to. So definitely check that out. Peter has a newsletter as well, as we all do. And you can catch him on stage at the Code Conference. And prior to that, I mean, just one hell of a media career in this city.
You're saying I'm old.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you were around at the advent of Silicon Valley Insider, which is now Insider, Forbes.com and Forbes, and all things digital at the Wall Street Journal for many years as well. And then went along as that morphed into Recode and with Kara Swisher and Walt Mossberg and that whole crew. Okay, I'll stop there. So anyway, quick round of applause for our panelists who are as good as it gets when it comes to this topic. So I'm going to start off with a fairly long question, and I promise my other questions will not be so long. But I wanted to begin by kind of setting the scene, at least as I understand it, and I hope roughly you understand it, which is the last 10 or 15 years of media, and we'll call it sort of print or digital media, just to stay in one lane for a bit. I think most of us are probably familiar with the broad strokes of this. Around 2010-ish, actually when I was getting into journalism, the great financial crisis had really laid bare some of the issues with legacy media. At Forbes, they were really grappling with the impact on the print business and on advertising, and struggling to kind of make sense of what a digital journalism business model would look like. And the next couple of years, and you can throw other outlets into that bucket as well. The New York Times certainly, I think, is an avatar for a lot of this. And at the same time, you had these digital-first publications, BuzzFeed, Vice, even Mashable at one point, to some extent Business Insider as well, who were kind of emerging as the models that would really define the next 10 years, and doing that largely based on ad-driven business models. And so if you were a betting person, if you were a smart person, and many people did bet on this by way of investment, in 2011, call it the early 2010s, you would bet that the BuzzFeeds and the Vices of the worlds were going to take over this industry and really emerge as kind of the defining media brands of this new era. That didn't happen. So BuzzFeed is a penny stock now. Vice no longer exists. New York Times has done fantastically well, and a lot of these publications that were really kind of flailing and going after all kinds of different models figured out that it's actually fairly simple, and it's actually fairly similar to the print model, which is subscribers. You need people to pay for your content, and advertisers. But really, the subscriber piece was key, and a lot of outlets, I think, resisted that for many years because that didn't seem to be the way that the internet wanted to work. And the cool thing to do was to not pay, or not ask people to pay. So I swear I'm just about done with this. My question to you is, what about that is right, that description? What about that description is wrong, or what have I missed in terms of that description?
I was going to say you should go first, but
All right.
yeah,
Go for it.
You go ahead.
It's a pretty good summary. I think I've written versions of that summary before.
I think you have.
I think a couple things to note is that that wave of investor interest in media, that's an anomaly. Usually venture capitalists, especially in the tech world, didn't want to touch media because it turns out in order to create a story, you have to hire a person to write that story. And if you want to make more stories, you have to hire more people. It's not like software. They had all convinced themselves for a period that these were somehow technology companies, I think mostly because they were on the internet. And also because sometimes places like BuzzFeed would say they were a technology company. But that was an anomaly to have all that money going into the sector. So it's a pretty small bubble by bubble standards, but it was a bubble. And then the other thing I'd point out about the move to subscriptions is what you're really talking about is the New York Times pulling that off really successfully. They really did shift their business model midway through the last decade. They sort of the graph crossed from them being primarily an advertising business to primarily a subscriber-supported business. And there are businesses like Sarah's, like The Information, a few others that target small, affluent audiences generally, that can do really well with a combination of subscriptions and ads. But if you take those people off the table, it's all pretty grim. It's not like subscriptions are a panacea. And I'm going to try to not be a bummer for the entire hour. There's that theory that you should drink a glass of water in between every alcoholic drink. And I'm going to try to leaven my crappiness with some pleasantness, but it's a pretty grim. Local news is terrible. Yeah. There's no solution for that. National publications that should be doing really well because they should be able to reach big audiences, and they've got billionaires owning them, like the Washington Post, like the LA Times. They're having a rocky go of it. So the narrative that we were in advertising, now we're in subscriptions and we solved it, it doesn't quite work. It's my only caveat.
Yeah, no, that's an important caveat. Sarah, what would you say?
I agree with everything that just came about. I guess the only thing I would add is that a lot of these digital first publications rode the social media wave and were able to generate a lot of traffic, riding distribution from the likes of Facebook and Twitter. And now that those platforms are shifting their models to be more like TikTok and are deprioritizing news and politics for regulatory concerns, a lot of outlets have found themselves in a very perilous position. I think, to your point, a lot of the business models were always a little gimmicky, selling a lot of like crappy branded content. All of that stuff was never sustainable, but I think it became clear that you really couldn't sustain a digital model off of this like scaled-based advertising thing pretty much in the past 2 years when X and Meta have like pivoted away from news. And so I think we're at the dawn of a new era, if you will.
So my next question, or the next logical question, is what does that new era look like? And if the answer is we don't know, that's fine. But I would love to understand what it could look like, or what some emerging green shoots might look like. Is it Puck? Is it something like Axios? What do we think could work over the next 10 years as kind of a new equilibrium for media?
Here, I ask for green shoots all the time. I like green shoot stories, and no one. And if anyone tells you, "Oh, I've solved it. Here's the model. You should run away." But it's try a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
The more elegant word is diversify, right? Sell subscriptions, sell advertising, do events, do podcasts. Figure out how to sell TV shows to Hollywood. Oops, that business just went away in the last 6 months. But keep looking for new stuff. Grow responsibly, because venture capitalist is not going to bail you out. Google's not going to bail you out. You're going to have to find an audience and figure out a way to make something they want to read and/or pay for, that an advertiser will also pay for, and hopefully turn a profit. It's that simple and that difficult. And again, I think there are lots of, niche markets where that can really work well. Axios, Puck, et cetera, they're primarily catering to a Washington, D.C. audience. Semaphore, launched by the two Smiths, is very much trying to be in that world as well. That's all great, but we can't have every new startup targeting Washington, D.C. sponsors. I'd love to find something that works for local, so would a lot of people. But that's a really grim one. I think what we have proved out the last few years is there's a lot of people willing to pay for things they care about. That may not be news. It may be, sure, I really care about long-haired Persian cats, and I'm going to join some group for $10 a month that gives me photos and access, and we're going to share tips, and that's really valuable. They are now, so that long-haired Persian cat group that I just made up in my head is now competing with your subscriber, your budget for subscribing to the Times or whatever else, and you're going to have to live with that. You can build really cool businesses there, but you may not be able to build what we usually call the traditional news business.
Totally agree with the niche strategy, and I think there's been a refocus on daily life services content. In the newspaper era, there was a lot of services. You could get your sports scores, you could get job listings and classifieds. There was a lot of opportunity to serve the reader with things outside of news. And then in the early internet era, I think a lot of those startups that you mentioned were so focused on chasing virality and traffic, they forgot about simple daily life services and how they could really attract people. And the New York Times has figured this out. That's why, about a third of their news subscriptions are games and cooking. And I think, at the local level, my company was acquired by traditionally a local news company. We're thinking about that stuff too. Like, how do you serve people in a way, a daily way that makes a subscription opportunity more appealing? Yeah. And it's different across the board. There's a company called Patch that has tried local news lunch calendars for schools. There's local companies that do like memberships where you can get access to certain local services like library memberships and things like that. I don't know if that's really going to work and be sustainable. The print model was so lucrative for so many different reasons, but I do think there's something there in that it can't just be delivering information, it has to be delivering a service.
I think these are all great points. And I know that Axios is kind of going, relatively big on, did this? No, this is still on, sorry. Basically, the canonical example I think about with Axios, you have Charlotte, for example. What is the average reader in Charlotte thinking about and opening up their Axios newsletter for in the morning? It's not what I do it for, which is you and Dan Premack and others. And it's really thinking back not to the standard kind of composition of information and whatever. It's thinking what is going to be useful in this kind of individual's life.
And it's so different from city to city. Charlotte is this sort of new up-and-coming economy. There's tons of new restaurants. There's tons of new bars. And a lot of our coverage is serving the city in that way. Whereas the local coverage we do in places like Atlanta and Maricopa County, Scottsdale, Phoenix is much more heavily political because those audiences demand that type of news and information. So each city we have like 2 to 3 reporters, and some cities we have recruited people who lean much more heavily in their expertise for things like food and bev or entertainment. For example, in Georgia, there's a huge entertainment market. Whereas in other cities, we are really focused on school boards and politics. It completely depends on each city. But I will say there's one consistent thing throughout, which is the format. I think we have found that people who want to get smarter faster, typically professionals, but just ambitious people, like the Axios format because it saves them time. And so no matter which city you go to, you're going to have the newsletter format look exactly the same.
Yeah. And just to round that out, I imagine that also alludes to the fact that there's a different advertiser or base in each city. So you kind of need to cater the model in that respect as well.
Yes and no. So there's obviously an opportunity in hyper-local businesses, small, medium-sized businesses in a particular city. But what we've found is that there's a lot of national advertisers who want to reach local audiences, but it's hard to do it in an intimate way, in a way that is really helpful for brand messaging on places like Google and Meta platforms. Those are great platforms for getting someone to purchase something or sign a petition. But these companies want local constituencies to think highly of their brand. Maybe they have a factory in that town. So that's where Axios is really unique. I'll give you an example. Like on Veterans Day, a company like Walmart, and this is just anecdotal, I'm not giving you actuals, they might need to message about their commitment to veterans, but that commitment's gonna look really different in a state like Texas, where we have Axios, Dallas, and Austin, and Houston, versus what they're doing for veterans maybe in places on the East Coast. So the messaging needs to be different, but they want to do it in a one consistent buy. How do you do that? I mean, you could go to a Gannett and try to do advertising and marketing across a bunch of their local papers. They have a partnership with McClatchy that allows you to do that. We're betting that we can do that in a really premium environment. And so the hyperlocal advertising is something, but the national brand advertising, just targeting it to local, that's where there's a lot of opportunity, and I think that's where we're really excited.
Sarah, you are a fantastic pitchwoman for Axios.
Thank you. I try my
must say.
best.
Yeah, and I know that is not your job, but my God. Just to sum up kind of what we've been saying about the future of media over the next decade, it sounds to me like it is more fragmented, and probably as a whole, in terms of revenue and maybe in terms of, I don't know, readership, we can leave that out of it, probably smaller. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are still going to find things that you wouldn't have thought had worked, find audiences you didn't know existed, find audiences that are going to pay for stuff. There's a company called The Athletic, it's now part of the New York Times, that said that we're gonna sell local sports coverage. And I thought, that's never gonna work. Anyone who cares about this stuff is already getting their local paper, et cetera. And it turned out The Athletic, up to a point, was able to find diehard fans, give them something they weren't getting somewhere else, and they would pay for it.
Yeah.
which again, I just did not think that market would exist. And you can debate how big the market is, but they found something there. And I think people will continue to get ambitious and lucky and stumble into things that they didn't think existed. But again, we're really going to have some big holes. We still don't have, the stuff that Sarah's company is doing is great, but that depends also on having other local news organizations that exist that they can summarize and augment. It's not a standalone product. And that's, I'm going to keep saying it, I really worry about not having a model that works for local news, because if we don't have any accountability, let alone just the ability to understand what's happening down the street, that's a real problem for the country.
Yeah, this wasn't originally a big part of my my plan for this discussion, but I do think it's important. And Sarah, I read some of your articles about, I think it was DC providing vouchers and other states and municipalities potentially doing the same. So basically there's this public support, but going directly through the population to make sure that there is a reasonably robust local news environment. I am candidly a little skeptical about just the political feasibility of that at scale.
Fly?
I think it
this
probably
country?
works in DC. I'm thrilled it works in New Jersey to some extent. I don't think that is going to work countrywide, at least at first blush.
Well, a couple of things on that. The reason they're doing it through a voucher program, the government gives you money and you give it to the various outlets, they put it in a separate bank account, is to have a separation between the outlet and the government so that they don't feel as though they can't cover the government. This is a huge problem abroad. In countries like Turkey or Hungary, the government floods these outlets with ad revenue and then threatens to yank it when they don't like the coverage. So the government-funded piece is really tough. There are models that kind of work. BBC is a much more effective model than, quite frankly, what we have here in the US with NPR and PBS. But 10,000-foot view, whether it's tax credits or vouchers or funding fellowship programs, these are all piecemeal things. There's no one, newspapers were a solution for local news, and to an extent, local broadcast has actually been quite effective. It's gone down the quality in recent years because of consolidation. We just don't have that one-shot thing in the digital era, and we might never have it. So I applaud everyone trying, but I'm also trying to reason my expectations.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. So again, some green shoots, some programs that seem promising, but not yet clear what the broader, more comprehensive solution is. I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to kind of what you were alluding to before, Peter, about the fragmentation and the fact that, yes, you can create a community around niche interests, and there is likely, at sort of, on the long tail side of things, money to be made there. And I think the biggest example of that in recent years is Substack. And I'm sure you know colleagues or, others in your industry who have gone off, put up newsletters, maybe built some nice little businesses out of it, and created, those kind of 1,000 true fan communities. That was sort of the original promise of the internet. How does that impact traditional outlets? And how does it impact, maybe not where you work, you're free to talk about that if you feel comfortable, but for example, I would follow either of you wherever you went, and I get the feeling that this is a new concept for a lot of organizations, the Times included, which I'm sure will come up here. So I just want to get your sense of the tension in that dynamic and that opportunity, especially for the best and the most well-known reporters these days.
I think that was a real concern at the Times and other legacy media companies, that we spent all this money building up the brands of these reporters and they're going to go off on their own and do their own thing. And there were a couple examples of it, but there aren't many. There's actually very few. And there's a few people who tried it and said, this is really hard to run your own business and have your monthly income vary wildly depending on how many new subscribers you had and what your churn rate is. And I'd rather be working with other people and with a group of people. And And if you look at Substack, I mean, like a lot of internet stuff, right? There's a band of well-known, very high-performing people at the very top, and then there's a lot of people who are making stuff that no one is reading, and they're not making much money from it. And I think that's all sort of settled. A lot of us got excited because, oh, you know, my colleague Matt Iglesias was making $800,000 a year after he left Vox. You see the numbers like that, go, we should all be doing this. But there's not many Matt Iglesiases out there. Barry Weiss left the Times, is building her own media company on the back of Substack for now. It'll probably go somewhere else. The other thing for the Barry Weisses and Matt Iglesias is a lot of these things are affinity plays. I like what Barry stands for, and you can debate that, and in the same way that you might like supporting NPR or, you know, pick your
Tribal badge.
Yeah, you want that badge, and the question is, how big can that get? Again, that can be a very good business for a lot of these people, but you know, once you get past the people who are ardent fans and really care about this stuff, are you going to be able to find more casual readers to pay month in? You know, I've definitely gone and thrown money at projects and people that I liked because I wanted to support them, and year 2, year 3, I'm like, I don't know, man. I could spend that $80 somewhere else.
I've got a lot of pocketed Noah Smith articles that just crowd my inbox, and Matt Iglesias, to be honest.
I totally agree with Peter. I think one new trend is you're starting to see media companies be forced to become more flexible in terms of their talent negotiations. So for example, like Sara Fischer, Peter's colleague, you know, I think she's a contributor to CNBC. She works with Vox. She has podcasts. You know, when she was at the Times, she still had a Vox podcast. Like, she's kind of all over the place. I think for some reporters, the outlets will need to be more flexible in terms of letting them do part-time work. I do part-time work. And one interesting thing is with reporters, where I think this has really come to a head, has been books. There was a lot of tension in the New York Times' latest union contract negotiations about reporters owning the IP of reporting that gets used to license to make shows. I think this is where the real tension is going to lie. I don't think newsrooms at this point are as worried, to Peter's point, about their top talent just like going to Substack, because it's not viable financially for everyone. But I think union negotiations and contracts become more contentious in this sort of, you know, talent-first world, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, but it plays out in different ways, right? Like, I don't want to step on anyone's. You know, one thing if the Times wants to keep you, they can offer you flexibility contract-wise. They can also give you a podcast if they want to keep you from going to the Washington Post. They have lots of different options. Right. And that idea that your work is going to be monetized by the company you work for and not yourself has always been a tension. It really heated up in the last few years, like you said. But again, that was also when we had this streaming bubble where they were making just shows out of everything. And again, that is just screeched to a halt. So, you know, a lot of these things, you can write a book, and God bless you for writing a book. It probably is not going to be a hit Netflix series. The odds. It's very unlikely. Maybe it'll get optioned. There's less money there than people, I think, have thought. And the publishers themselves are now realizing this. So that tension may resolve on its own.
I think that's all very helpful. And I think we solved it. So I do want to move on. And want to get, you know, sort of, I mean, it's not at the core of all of this, but it's pretty damn close, which is the fact that the new Gallup polls were released last week, I believe. Trust in American media is at an all-time low, or at least matching an all-time low from 2016. I can see that every day in my life, or, you know, going back home for Thanksgiving, I'm sure to see that. What can be done about that? Is there any hope for that trajectory to change? How should newsrooms think about that? What should we do?
I don't think this is a solve, but I think transparency is really important. In the migration of print to digital, we, as a news industry, all used very different terms to describe what we were writing online. Like, what is view versus analysis versus opinion versus commentary versus blog? And I think that caused a lot of confusion and a loss of trust, because it was hard for readers to discern whether or not this was valid fact-based information or opinion. And the muddling of that could have been solved if the industry had more things like a uniform disclosure in print. An op-ed was the opinion across from the editorial. You understood what that was. And I'm concerned moving into the AI era even more about this issue of not having uniform disclosures. So some news outlets, this content's written by machines. Others, it's not. It's gonna, I think, make the trust problem a lot worse. The best thing we could do is, as an industry, come together and have, defining terms and practices. Covering, like, this is getting in the weeds, but the various trade associations and the various factions even within the news industry. Okay, the local lobby has a different feeling about big tech than the big national news lobby. I don't know that we're going to get there. And so that is, I think, the biggest issue right now.
Just in terms of AI, the approach to AI and disclosure?
In so many different facets. Like, I remember the Local Media Consortium was so angry at the big national guys for trying to lobby hard against Google and Facebook, because they said, like, we actually need their support. And I'm seeing this with AI. Some news companies are like, great, there's a big chunk of money if I license my content for the use of large language models. Let's do it.
Right.
Yeah. And then there are others that are like, this is sacred and this is our only value and we're going to sue you if you do it. And just the lack of a uniform approach, not just to whether or not you work with these companies, but how you disclose all that, I think has done a number on trust.
So there's a bit of dividing and conquering going on, maybe.
Yeah.
Peter.
Positive, I'll start with that. You're seeing the Times, but also Vox and other publications forget about what they're labeling their stories. They're trying to tell the readers more about how their story is getting to them. Oftentimes, literally just like, here's who this author is, and it's at the top. This person has written for these publications, is an expert on this. Here's a photo of them. That's a new thing at the New York Times the last few years. Even playing around with what a dateline is, right? Were you actually at Gaza City, or did you report from Jerusalem? Making that stuff clearer to an audience. Again, it's an audience that has to want to know about this stuff. It's really people in this room, honestly. But in theory, if you want to know more about it, and this stuff was happening pre-AI. This was, we want to establish more trust, that people understand that human beings are making this stuff and why they're making that stuff. I think that's really great. That Gallup poll, distrust in media, that's a pretty steady arc over the last, since the 60s, right? And not coincidentally, that's when Richard Nixon, with the help of Roger Ailes, was running against the media. And both sides do it, but the Republicans do it a lot more. I mean, a lot of this is about polarization. It's, you don't distrust Fox News, you distrust the other news that you don't like. That's a lot of what people are talking about. In the same way you hate Congress, but you like your local congressperson. If we really do get to a point where no one believes anything and we're just fully nihilistic, that nothing means anything anymore, then we're all fucked. And we're not going to have those panels.
Where it seems to be going, yeah.
But I will say, we like to crap on the platforms, and they're full of disinformation and misinformation. I've really gotten a lot of value out of TikTok during the Israeli-Hamas war, in large part just because they're bringing me all kinds of crap, but they're also bringing me clips from CNN and ABC. They're also bringing me clips from Al Jazeera and Channel 4 in the UK. Outlets outside of the US cover that conflict very differently. And you can debate who's right and who's wrong, but it's really useful to just see, oh, the world views this in different ways. Again, you have to want to lean into that and think about that stuff, but I find that really useful. The idea that, a Chinese-owned social video app is going to be the one bringing us different viewpoints in news is alarming. I wish there were other ways
At
that
least
was
here
happening,
they're
but
gonna do
I'll
that,
take
yeah.
it. It's good.
Yeah. That was brighter than I would have expected. So you've definitely, yes, you did zig. I mean, what I take away from that is essentially, this is a bigger issue than media. This is kind of just a societal issue. We're not going to likely be able to solve it, but it is important to try and adapt to it and show your work a little bit more and show what goes into real fact-checked, thorough journalism in a way that maybe publications, certainly traditional publications, just sort of took for granted that that was understood and trusted in years past, but is no longer. Okay. I have two topics I want to get to before we get to 45 past the hour, which is when we're going to open it up for audience questions. Those are Twitter and AI. And we talked about AI, we alluded to it a bit in the last discussion, back and forth. But my more direct question around it is, what is a responsible use of AI in a competitive newsroom? And the reason I say competitive is because I think a lot of maybe old school journalists would say there is no responsible use. But there are business realities here, and I think there is clearly incentive to find ways to do more with less. AI is kind of the example of a tool that promises to do that. So what should that look like, or can that look like in responsible newsrooms going forward?
Well, I think for media companies or news companies, you have the editorial side and the business side. And I think there's a lot that the business sides should be doing to optimize their businesses in a way that won't impact the journalism. I can't tell you, I used to be in the advertising world, how much human-based Excel work needs to be displaced by AI. Advertising optimization, optimizing campaigns, revenue, and sort of billing, all of that stuff, accounting, there's a lot that AI can do, and I think a lot of news companies are going through their supply chain on the business side, finding friction points and trying to figure out what can we optimize, through automation. On the editorial side, I think most newsrooms are uncomfortable putting out AI-written articles. CNET did this and they didn't disclose it, and it was a huge fiasco. Newsrooms are handling it differently. A lot are creating committees to explore best practices before they implement finalized rules. I think most companies are comfortable with their employees experimenting with it, to maybe strengthen the headline or to strengthen their social media copy or things like that. But the actual leveraging AI to write is pretty far off. I think the area where I'm the most excited as a reporter, in which AI and generative AI could be powerful, I waste my time talking about those friction points doing a lot of things that have quite frankly, they require a little editorial judgment, but I waste too much time on them. Searching Getty for photos, I waste too much time doing that. Tagging all the metadata on a story, I waste too much time on that. So if those things can be optimized with AI, that's a newsroom function. I think that could be wonderful. But for now, I think writing an article with AI, unless it's earnings reports or local sports stories, feels like a little far off.
Right. So some, tools in the CMS that are not related to writing, but are related to these kind of adjacent things that you have to do to get an article up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because that stuff, it sucks to do that stuff.
Yeah, they've been playing with sports scores and earnings reports that are automated for more than a decade. There's been companies taking a crack at this, and again, you can debate, all right, well, at one point Reuters offshored most of the earnings reports coverage to Bangladesh and India, and the next step is to automate that stuff. And how do you feel about that? Generally, you're taking the least valuable stuff you can do and assigning that to progressively lower paid workers, and eventually end up with robots doing that. It's kind of gross, but kind of makes sense. Luckily for people like me and Sarah right now, the attempts to do more sophisticated versions of robot work don't work yet, but they'll get better. And you're absolutely going to see the CNETs of the world, the Geo Medias of the world try to speed that up, either because they think it's actually a good idea or they think they're going to get rewarded for it for an investor. They can make more content faster, cheaper. There's an inevitable just pressure to do that. So that is going to happen. And even if you have responsible newsrooms who say, we don't want any part of this, they're going out in an advertising world where they're competing for clicks and page views with stuff that is entirely automated and very often bad. And again, you're sort of this race to the bottom where you're having robots make stories that are really only going to be viewed by other robots to generate increasingly smaller fractions of pennies.
It's robots all the way down.
So, I mean, none of those are sustainable businesses. Eventually, great, I've figured out how to make 1 billion stories a second, but like, you're not getting anything from it. Most of the newsroom, most of the publishers that when I talk to about AI, they're most concerned about trying to extract value out of Google and Microsoft and OpenAI, people who they think have already benefited from their work and are going to continue to, and they're hoping to get really big checks from those guys, and I think that will take some time. I have yet to see most publishers spend a lot of time thinking about, other than the workflow stuff you're talking about, Sarah, bringing that stuff. But again, it's all pretty new. I mean, OpenAI really, ChatGPT is really a year old.
Yeah, I think it'll be a year in next month.
Yeah, and Sarah's probably seen this, like consumer interest in reading about those stories just fell off a cliff this spring, but it's not going away. And I think a lot of this stuff is going to, instead of going to ChatGPT, you're just going to end up using tools that have some sort of AI built into them. You won't know that they have AI built into them or care. They're just better versions of tools. And I think that's inevitably what we're going to have in newsrooms as well. It's just tools that happen to be powered by AI but do something better and faster and cheaper.
Which is sort of the promise of what OpenAI or others would say, I think.
Language translation is the best one. During the war, we've had a lot of statements come from government leaders. I just pop that into a translator, and AI gets me the translation in seconds. Like, that's the type of stuff that'll make our lives easier. I used to pay so much money I would send my tape recording to a transcriber. Now you just use Otter, which is an AI-driven transcription tool. So we're saving time and money with these AI tools, but yeah, again, it's just optimization.
Cool. That's a little bit more positive than I would have thought. So yeah, we're doing it.
Bringing the smiles.
Last topic before we get to audience questions is Twitter. And man, I don't want to talk about it, but I feel like we have to talk about it because it is a big part of the media universe, just in the fact that I would imagine the two of you spend a lot of time on it. I certainly do, more than I would like. Several times over the last year or so, it has felt like this is it. That's the last straw. People are moving somewhere else, and there is going to be another Twitter, whether that's Blue Sky or Mastodon or whatever. And it is pretty resilient, and I understand why. So do we have any reason to expect that dynamic will change in a meaningful way over the next, let's call it 2 or 3 years, or is it just going to muddle through and continue to survive and have the influence that it does?
I have some thoughts because I've been spending months working on a series about this. One, we should be clear when we talk about Twitter who we're talking about. There's a couple 100 million people who are using that. Only a small number of them are doing media stuff. Yep. Those are the people Elon Musk really wanted to reach, by the way, and a lot of them have left Twitter. And I still use it, and Sarah uses it, but you get much less engagement there. You're obviously reaching less people there. But there's other communities on Twitter that are perfectly happy with the way things are. Black Twitter, but all kinds of niche Twitter users, or just Twitter users. I'm like, it's fine for me. I don't care who runs it. It works basically fine. I think, again, we kind of overvalued the news value of Twitter early on, when we were saying it was going to fuel the Arab Spring, and the idea that it was going to flatten this curve where a regular person could be on the same footing as Anderson Cooper and could interact with Anderson Cooper, and a lot of that has sort of gone away. I love the story about there was an engineer in Pakistan who was just tweeting one day about how there was a loud noise and what are these helicopters doing? It turns out he was live tweeting the Osama bin Laden raid. Not knowing that. And so that blew everyone's mind back in 2008, 2009, 2010. And then it sort of settled down to, all right, it's a way for journalists to kibitz and schmooze and fight with each other. It's an assignment desk in a lot of ways, for better and for worse. And I think newsrooms also have a lot of the smarter ones have said, all right, we're going to actively tell and you even see like the New York Times editor saying, you should get off of Twitter. You shouldn't have not used Twitter, but you should spend less time on Twitter because you're not going to find good stories there. And I think that's true. And I think Twitter will still, again, when the war started, the supreme leader of Iran was immediately on Twitter sending out missives. I mean, it's still going to be a thing that lots of people use, in part because there isn't something else they can use to reach people like that. But I don't think it's the crucial tool we all have thought it was. And certainly, I mean, I spend an embarrassing amount of time on it still. And some days I'm like, I spent my day on Twitter, which meant I got nothing done. So I don't think it's the worst thing if we take a little fast.
I agree with that completely. And I think the one area that I'm curious about is people do go to Twitter for like emergency services. For example, I live right near the White House. I'm always trying to figure out, like the man in Pakistan, why is there an emergency helicopter circling the White House or circling over my apartment? I always go to Twitter for that insight because I want to see if other users are posting closer pictures. That's like hard to search and find on TikTok. Not as many people are trying to go to TikTok to post real-time news events. So there's a use case there, okay, that whatever, C or E, ACE, you New Yorkers know, train is down, like, go to Twitter, see what's happening. Is there a fire? The challenge that I think Elon Musk is going to face is with the new verification system, it's less useful in that way. And so I think there's an opportunity for someone to replace or to challenge that, or for him to just kind of improve that.
But again, in other parts of the world, that already exists, right? No one here uses Telegram, but in other parts of the world, in Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Gaza, Telegram is the main news source anyway. I was talking to a guy who does research at Bellingcat, which does a lot of these forensic crowdsource things to figure out, where did that crater come from? And he said, one, I'm on Telegram because there's just way more stuff going on there. There's no moderation at all, so you have to sort of pick and choose what you're looking at. But on the other hand, there's a ton of stuff there. And at the same time, he was telling me this, I'm spending much less time on Twitter because the incentive system that Elon Musk has put in where I'm going to pay you for virality. There's always been incentives to go viral, but now there's a direct monetary incentive to put crap out there has made it much less useful for him. But again, I think it's weirdos like you and me, Sarah, who were looking at Twitter when you heard a weird sound outside and wanted to know. And it only kind of worked if you were in a city of a certain size. And again, there are substitutes for that. There's Nextdoor, there's Citizen, which is really gross and has all kinds of problems. But people are finding alternatives for those use cases.
No, I totally get that. And I think that perspective is very valuable. But to your point, the weirdos are the media. And I think remain in an outsized way on Twitter. As much as we would welcome a fast, I certainly would. I don't see it happening.
Threads is getting better.
It is getting better. That's a very good point. Yeah, I've been impressed. I left it for dead. So with that, we have about 12 minutes left. I'm sorry I cut into some of your time. One caveat before we get into audience questions, and I'm just going to ask you to stand up and ask one question, and hopefully do that very quickly because we do want to get to as many as we can. And if you raise your hand, I will try to get to as many of you as I possibly can. So I see Peter already.
Do I have to stand up?
You don't have to stand up. I take it back.
So I too am very concerned about the fate of quality journalism and the state of quality journalism. There's great journalism going on, ProPublica, the Information Axios. I'm wondering what you guys feel are the biggest threats to quality journalism. Is it the fact that, everything's paywalled, all the best outlets are paywalled and people can't afford it? Is it the bad actors that are putting out misinformation and whatever? Is it AI created like video that is just not, I mean, that scares me, that we can't tell the difference between a legitimate news story and whatever. And so what are the biggest threats? And I know there's some great journalism going on, but there are some, macro things going on as well that, so in your opinion.
I think the greatest threat is the loss of trust in institutions in general in the United States. With the Gallup data, the thing they noted was that the lack of the loss of trust in media is coming with the loss of trust in government, in local police forces, in the military, in religious institutions. You know, small businesses is the one area where we continue to see growth in trust, but other than that, there is a larger thing happening here that's bigger than the media, and I think the loss of trust in the media is one component of that, and I think until we can get to a point where there's more trust societally in a bunch of these institutions, the media as an institution is not going to regain it.
That's all true, and I just add the other thing that I'm most concerned about is business models. Someone has to make the stuff, someone has to distribute it. You can get co-ops and people to do it for free, but someone has to make this stuff, and if we can't make it viable for journalists to do journalism, then none of this matters.
Right. Need profitable organizations at scale. Yes.
Thank you all for being here. This is so great. Sarah, you had a piece, I think, earlier this month about how referral traffic from Meta or from Facebook and from X have just plummeted. It's never been great from X, but in the past year or so. At the same time, you know, Peter, as you noted, going to TikTok and seeing all kinds of content from ABC and the BBC and all over is a great way to find, you know, what's going on in the world. So my question is, how, if you had to advise outlets on how and where they should distribute their content these days, or if they should, what would you say?
That's a great point, and thank you for that question and for being a reader. The thing about Meta, particularly Facebook and X, that was appealing for news organizations was that there was an easy opportunity to link out, which allowed you to reap the benefits of that traffic. Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat do not have strong vehicles to link out, which means that we cannot derive the value of that traffic. So for me, those outlets have become marketing tools. And if you can build a brand there, hopefully you can engage consumers to go to places where you can monetize them, whether that's building trust with the NBC brand so they're more likely to turn on NBC in a breaking news situation, or developing a more trusted relationship with Savannah Guthrie, so you're more likely to buy those flip-flops from the Today Show commerce store. I think that's the strategy. I think news organizations have to be everywhere, but Peter made a point earlier, which is news organizations have to be more prudent about costs. And I think there was a time when Facebook said, oh, we're going to pay you so much for video, that publishers bloated these big social video teams. I think now we understand, like, you have to figure out how to be in all these platforms, but do it in a prudent manner. And as a result, I don't see as many platforms, quite frankly, making beautiful custom explainer videos for YouTube the way that we saw Vox do that. I think they are trying to figure out the best margin. Where can I put my content to derive the most brand value in the least amount of with the least amount of effort and cost in? And so the easiest way to do it is, like, you know, repurposing the same video across a bunch of different platforms and hiring one person to cut it, using AI and different things to help with those editing processes. I think that's like the future.
The only thing I'd add is, you know, everyone's saying this now belatedly, that they've all realized we can't depend on any of these platforms, because even if they're well-intentioned, they're going to change their mind at some point. You know, and again, like our social media people were always telling us to ignore Twitter for years. This is preceded Elon. There's, like, it doesn't generate any traffic to you. But leaving that aside, the idea that whether it's Instagram or Snap or whatever, everyone sort of has gone through enough of these cycles to realize, all right, we're going to try all these things. We're going to continue to invest some money experimenting with different distribution. Sometimes it's marketing. Sometimes maybe there is revenue we can get if we can get traffic back. But we're fundamentally going to have to hope that we can find people where they are, bring them to our homepage. That's one of the reasons we all love email, right? You have a direct connection with your reader, and hope, right? You just can't. None of these platforms is going to save us, but they're also not going to kill us either. They need some of our stuff. One of the things that happened in that era we were talking about, like as Sarah mentioned, was these companies all convinced themselves that Facebook was growing really big. They were going to grow along with Facebook, and that Facebook would need their content.
That was BuzzFeed, right?
BuzzFeed, Vice, Vox, all of us had some version of it. And it was pretty clear to me, because I'm old, I'd seen this with like Yahoo. And when I worked at Forbes.com, the most important person in the newsroom was the one who got our stories on the homepage of Yahoo. And then one day Yahoo said, oh, we don't need Forbes' stuff. We can just put our own stuff there. So you can work with the platforms, but they are not going to be aligned with you.
And I totally agree with that. And just a quick anecdote. One thing that's funny is this is not really just an online phenomenon. Like, big conference businesses really struggled in the pandemic if they weren't diversified. The newspaper industry is really struggling because they were able to pay truck drivers and honestly even just everyday people pretty low cost to deliver papers in the morning. Now those people are like, why am I waking up at 3:30 in the morning? I'm just going to do Uber on my way home from work. And so they have to now deliver newspapers through the postal service. So it's like this platform dependency is not just a digital thing, but I think we are hyper-focused on it as a digital thing because we became so over-reliant, especially like on Facebook for a long time.
Very helpful. Other questions? In the back.
Hi, I work in local media, and I just wanted to ask you about the role of philanthropy. It's made a big splash recently, and I wonder if 5 years from now, do you think we'll still be talking about philanthropy as one of many sources of quote, revenue in local media?
Yes, but as we're all learning right now in real time, philanthropy is not a guaranteed recurring revenue source. The guy whose name is on this building, Craig Newmark, has put a lot of money into local media, and I'm a little confused about the coverage, but it looks like he's pulled back on some of that. He was funding a great publication in New York called The City, and apparently their funding is reducing. So the best model for local news seems to be some combination of advertising, reader, you can either call them subscriptions or donations or contributions, and some sort of corporate philanthropy. You sort of need all three of those to work. That's only going to work in certain markets, frankly, that have money and a motivated corporate sort of citizenship thing going on, and readers who want it. There's going to be news deserts. But I think philanthropy is absolutely going to be an important leg.
I agree, and I think philanthropy moves in waves. There was an era where everyone was trying to get everyone vaccinated. Like Bill and Melinda Gates were putting money towards it. That was a huge philanthropic effort. Then there was a big effort to fund improvement in cities, homelessness, education. Chan Zuckerberg initiative puts $100 million into Newark schools. And then there was this era of almost like philanthropy in news, but also vanity philanthropy in news. You know, Mark Benioff buying Time and Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. And so I think it moves in waves. And so we should expect the same thing. But the one trend that I actually don't think will go away, the trend towards nonprofits, I think is interesting because that allows you to collect reader revenue. You couldn't necessarily accept certain kinds of reader revenue. You couldn't always accept certain types of philanthropy unless you were a nonprofit. So we've seen a huge pivot to nonprofits, and I don't think that's going away. I think that's going to continue to be a trend.
Right here.
Hello, good evening. I have a question for the three of you. I've seen a lot of service-based companies launching their own media. Like, do you feel like those are real media? So I'm coming from France. I see that some of them are partnering with TV channels that struggle to have some audience, and those companies also are considered as a trust institution actually for the audience. So how do you see this trend? Is it something that all the startups should rush on it or not? And even I see nonprofits starting to think about this model also of media revenue. Thank you.
So sort of corporate media. I mean, to some extent, I think of Andreessen's efforts at this. There are, I'm sure, other salient examples, but I guess the viability and the perception of those efforts.
The ones, the Andreessen thing, by the way, already stopped.
Yep.
Like they were going to make their own blog, and now they got out of that. But the ones I'm thinking about are, you had mattress companies funding magazines because they seem cool.
Yes.
And some of the magazines were cool, and then it turns out that, when push comes to shove, if you're a mattress company, you've really got to concentrate on selling mattresses, and when you need to cut costs, you're going to cut Mel magazine first. So, again, God bless. Everyone should try everything. But I think particularly if you're going to work for, if you're doing news for a company whose business is not news, you should have an eye on the door sort of all the time.
Yeah. mean, Airbnb had one. This was a trend. This was, I think a lot of venture-backed businesses were like, we are going to have a physical magazine because we're that cool.
It also turns out that those are not good ways to sell mattresses. It turns out, a lot of you're seeing this now, you're seeing a version of that with the sports gambling money that's come into media in the last few years. And it turns out that, one, that money's not going to last forever, but also that those companies are now realizing that's not a great way to acquire a gambler, is to sort of set up your own media company. There's benefits to that still, and there's benefits to working with an ESPN, but they aren't as big as they thought.
I think the broad trend is, totally agree. I think the broad trend is using media as a means to, or especially news, using news especially, but using media as a means to upsell the customer to something else. The customer always sniffs through it, and it's a harder sell, whereas using profits from something else to fund journalism and media, that works. I don't know that it works the other way around.
You have a lot of executives with podcasts, and you've got a lot of companies that had, big content, plays, A lot of journalists are going to work for companies and creating the content on their site, so.
But again, when those companies look around and say, well, what are we getting out of this now that money's tighter? And again, look at Andreessen, right? Like, they were going to build their own media business, and it turned out that was harder than they thought, and also they don't need to do it. And so it's easy to just get, lots of executives have podcasts. They have no audience for the most part. And, eventually that people are going to figure out there's no reason to put time and resources there unless you like the vanity of it, in which case go for it.
So you're saying it's a zero interest rate phenomenon for the most part? Yeah. Okay. Well, we are at 6 p.m., 6:02, so we are going to end it here. But another big round of applause for Sara and Peter, who were fantastic. And I do want to thank you all for coming. I know this room is not that conducive to mingling and networking and all of that. I think we can go out into the lobby if folks want to hang around for a little bit. But thank you all. We hope to do this again and really appreciate you all coming.